this a photo or a recording?
Recording. So can you tell us like a little bit about your role in the gay rights movement?
Sure, and we'll talk about the thesis you just gave out.
Yes.
Okay. My role in the gay rights movement. So for the last 10 plus years, I've been the president of Freedom to Marry, which is the campaign to win marriage nationwide. I founded the organization in 2003, 2001 actually. Prior to that, I was at Lambda Legal, which is the leading legal rights group for the movement, for 12 years full-time and several years pro bono before that. So for, God, how long is it now? For 20 plus years, I've now been doing gay rights work with Lambda Legal, with Freedom to Marry, and affiliated with other organizations as well. And I've worked on the range of cases involving gay rights and HIV/AIDS, and also most notably have led the fight to win marriage in the United States.
So have you had any experiences where religion has held you back, or you've like talked
or
to people?
helped you, or just like hadn't been.
Right. Yeah, so let me respond to the thesis you laid out, which I think is a very thoughtful and smart thesis, but I actually do think it's a little more complex than you had initially sketched out. And by that I mean it is true that in some ways the church played a very positive and strong role in the, for example, the African American civil rights movement, in a way that you can't point to the church as an institution playing that same central driving role in the gay movement. Most notably because the African American church was such an important part of the African American community and played the positive role that we think of it as playing. However, it actually was much more complicated than that, because the religion was as much a part of the problem of African American subordination and slavery and resistance to change and so on, as it was an engine of change that we think of it as being. So there was the positive part we all think of, but actually religion was all over the map on slavery and on racial justice. And certainly if you broaden the civil rights lens beyond race relations to, for example, the equality of women and so on, religion has been all over the map. There are progressive religious voices that helped fight for women's rights and reproductive freedom and choice, and there are religious institutions and leadership on exactly the opposite side, preaching that a woman should be in the home and should not be, should submit to her husband and all that kind of stuff. So it really isn't as clean a contrast between, it was good on African American civil rights and bad on gay rights, because it wasn't so good on religion as a force was not monolithically good when it came to the race struggle and women's equality struggle and other civil rights struggles. And on the other hand, although it is true that many prominent religious voices and the religious hierarchy in the Catholic Church, for example, and the Mormon Church are amongst the leading opponents of gay equality and have become really engines of discrimination almost when others are stopping. They're like the last ones still going in the discriminatory direction. So you think of them as leading the charge on the bad side. There also are religious voices and religious leaders who have been pro-gay and who have stepped up and been important parts of the work to advance. So the picture is just not as clear on either side of your thesis as the thesis suggests. If you think of the African American church and Martin Luther King and all those kind of things, then religion looks good when it comes to race. But religion was a mainstay of propping up slavery. It was a mainstay of preaching segregation. Martin Luther King famously said, the most segregated place is the church on Sunday, So it just wasn't as clear on either side of the picture.
Yeah, and there are also we studied how the gay rights movement sort of sparked congregations of gay and lesbians who still wanted a church community.
That's right.
So they had their own sort of religious, like the Unitarian Church and other things like that. Have you been involved in any of that?
Right. Well, I've worked closely with many of those leaders and institutions, and in each of the marriage battles that we've fought and won, we've had important religious clergy coalitions and leadership voices that people of faith as individuals and clergy as community leaders have been part of. So they've definitely been parts of the campaigns, parts of the efforts, and that has been important.
Mm-hmm.
All of that said, I think you are right that one of the main arguments made against gay people's equality gets dressed up in religion. And religion gets used very often as an excuse by people to justify their shutting down. I don't even think it's so much the reason people are anti-gay. I think it's often the excuse they give. It's sort of the permission they give themselves. They can easily just sort of say, oh, well, the Bible says such and such, even if they've never even read the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, religion is a major part of the challenge that gay people face, because unless you get people to push past an easy and quick and superficial invocation of the Bible says to actually talk about, well, what does the Bible really say about values? What does it say about fairness? What does it say about justice? What does it say about compassion? What does it say about respect for love and commitment? And don't you think it's important to not judge other people? And don't you think it's important to treat others as you would want to be treated, the golden rule? Unless you can get people to go past sort of a superficial invocation of religion as a permission to shut down and go to a really wrestling with values that underlie religion that actually work on our side, it's a problem. And so in that sense, religion is an obstacle for many of the battles and is used as an excuse to block our progress. But again, you could, although it's easy to see that when it comes to the gay rights movement, you could actually point to the same thing when it comes to any other movement,
Yeah.
women's movement, racial justice movement, and so on.
So who is your component when you're fighting these marriage battles?
Yeah, well, a lot of the opposition is funded by a narrow set of funders and anti-gay groups that often are identified as religious. I think the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the United States over the last 10 to 15 years has gotten more and more right-wing and has really become more and more zealously anti-gay, way out of step with the majority of Catholics. You know, the polls show that 63% of American Catholics support the freedom to marry, but the Roman Catholic hierarchy has gotten more and more extreme and more anti-gay and has been willing to put more and more resources into the anti-gay fight, even as they're shutting down parochial schools and shutting down soup kitchens and selling churches and so on. They're running out of money, but they're putting what money they have increasingly into the anti-gay fight. So they're definitely a part of the opposition and prominent examples of religiously identified figures who are the opposition, or the problem. Some of the leading anti-gay groups, or I would say actually most of the leading anti-gay groups, also identify as religious. Although when you look at what they do, it's hard to find any actual religious activity other than being anti-gay.
Mm-hmm.
So the so-called National Organization for Marriage is fueled by and funded by right-wing Catholic funders, and initially was, I think, also propped up by the Mormon Church, although I think they've backed away a little bit. The anti-gay industry of groups, the opposition groups like Family Research Council, Focus on the Family, and so on, these are all religiously identified. Again, it's a little hard to see what they actually do that's so religious other than have their zealous anti-gay, anti-choice agenda.
Yeah.
Like as an excuse, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, the two things. I mean, look, I'm sure there are some people who believe this is their vision of what religion is and so on, but of course there are many people who would read the same texts, pray to the same God, and come to a very different interpretation, of what the values really mean. When I was talking about the excuse thing, what I was saying is that you will find people who will say, oh, I'm not for that because the Bible says such and such. But these are people who are more than willing to ignore what the Bible says on a million other things. That, like the Bible says slavery is okay. The Bible says women should be subordinate. The Bible says you should not blend two different kinds of fabric. There are tons of things that the Bible says that people just don't take seriously anymore because they recognize it's the product of a different time and it isn't true to their true religious values. So when people invoke the Bible or invoke religion, often they're invoking it not as the reason that they have the position, but as the excuse. It's the permission to shut down and not think about it. The reason is more often this is something they're not familiar with, it's something they're uncomfortable with, it's something they don't know enough about, they don't quite understand it, and so they have a resistance, and then it's easy to sort of not engage with that resistance and not think it through by just saying, oh, but the religion says so and such. Even though on 100 other things, that would not be enough because they know the religion and the Bible don't point them to where they actually want to go, so they don't use it. But when it points them to a place that fits their discomfort, then they invoke it. So it's the excuse, not the reason.
When you when you set up or when you win the right for people to marry, I guess now it's good as of June when.
Here in New York, yes.
Yeah, but in other places, are most of the weddings, like who is conducting the wedding? Is it religious figures?
Well, gay people, like non-gay people, are parts of religious communities and have religious values and have families and so on. So, it's really all over the map.
Will the Catholic Church still do it?
Oh, well, of course, obviously it's up to every religion to decide what marriages they will perform. Even though the state now issues marriage licenses without discrimination, the state doesn't tell any religion what marriages they have to celebrate. A Jewish couple can't get a marriage license and go and demand that a priest marry them.
Yeah.
So it's obviously up to every religion. So the Catholic hierarchy will not allow Catholic priests to perform marriages. So as of now, there are no Catholic religious marriages being performed, even though Catholics are getting married.
Yeah.
And different faiths have different standards. Some ministers will, some won't. Some rabbis will, some won't. And obviously, 40% or so of Americans get married by civic figures. They get married by a clerk at the clerk's office or a judge or a justice of the peace without ever going to church.
Yeah.
So many gay people are having ceremonies that don't involve a religious officiant, but many are having religious ceremonies. And many religions are performing union ceremonies and blessing ceremonies for gay people, even in places where the law does not yet allow the legal marriage. I mean, I've actually been to more religious ceremonies for gay unions than I have gay marriages.
Really?
Yeah. Just as it happens, the mix of people I've known.
Any more
I think
questions?
that's pretty much covers it.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.